So the next item in the cardiac chapter, in the heart chapter, is blood flow, heart sounds, and the cardiac cycle. So the cardiac cycle is the sequence of events that happens between the relaxation and contraction of the heart. Relaxation is called diastole, contraction is called systole. So it says in here principles of pressure and flow, because this is what's going to make the blood flow inside the heart. This is very easy to understand in the sense that the measurement of pressure, for example, is done with an sphygmomanometer. Obviously, everybody has seen that. But these pressures that we're talking about talks about basically physics. And you have in here pressure, gradient, and flow. Everybody should understand this directly from Anatomy 1 regarding passive and active transportation. And remember, we said passive transportation is the movement of substances from one side of high concentration or pressure to another area of low concentration of pressure. So right here they are using a syringe in order to show you that pressure 1. Right here you have pressure 1, pressure 2. The concept in here is basically the same, high to low. So if you have more in here and you have less in here, then everything will flow this way. So fairly easy to understand, high to low pressure. Why? Because in this case we are talking about the amount of blood that we are going to have in our heart. So then the blood will flow from the right atrium to the right ventricle. Why? Because the right atrium will contract first. Therefore, the pressure in the right atrium is going to be higher than the pressure in the right ventricle. So it will go from high to low. Fairly easy to understand. Obviously, if you understood in Anatomy 1 how things move from high to low pressure. So again, if we're looking in these figures, they are trying to show you that. Might as well talk about a very important concept, which is the cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle is the sequence of events that are going to happen in your heart. So the first thing that is going to happen is ventricular filling. As you can see in there, the ventricle is going to be filled with blood. So then the ventricular filling right here obviously is going to happen because there's going to be high pressure in the atrium, low pressure in the ventricle. Because there's high pressure, the blood will flow from high pressure to low pressure, and that's what's going to cause the first part of the cardiac cycle, which is the ventricular filling. Step number 2 in the cardiac cycle, this one right here. This one is going to be isovolumetric contraction. Iso means the same. Isovolumetric means same volume. Why? Because if the pressure in here is, let's say, 3, and the pressure right here in your pulmonary trunk, more specifically right here in the valves, let's say is 9. So if this is 3 and this is 9, obviously the blood will not flow because this is low pressure, this is high pressure. And as we said, it always moves from high pressure to low pressure. So again, if this is 3 and this is 9, this blood will definitely not flow right here. So why is it called isovolumetric? Iso means same, volumetric means volume and contraction. So isovolumetric contraction, because even though the ventricle is contracting, right, it started in 0, it started the contraction, so it went to 1, to 2, to 3, to 4. So the contraction is starting and is increasing, but the volume does not change because it doesn't get pumped here. Why? Because even though the pressure is increasing here, it's not higher than the pressure that you have right here in the pulmonary trunk. Therefore, this amount of blood will not get pumped. Therefore, this part of the cardiac cycle is called isovolumetric contraction. Guess what the next step is going to be? Well, eventually the pressure right here is going to be 10, and in here is going to be 9. So then in that case, this blood will get pumped from the ventricle into your pulmonary trunk. And then obviously that is going to give you the next step, which is ventricular ejection. Why ventricular ejection? Because the pressure now in the ventricle is going to be higher than the pressure in the pulmonary trunk. Therefore, the blood will get pumped. And this is called again systole. What happens after this gets pumped? Then obviously systole is first. Then the ventricle needs to relax. Ventricular diastole. Because it relaxes, it expands. So then the cycle can start over again. And the atrium will relax. The atrium will pump the blood into the ventricle, because the last step of the cardiac cycle is ventricular relaxation. Okay, or I is going to be called ventricular relaxation or isovolumetric relaxation. Why is also isovolumetric? Because there's going to be certain volume in here that is going to remain from the ventricular ejection. approximately in here you have 130 mil. Yeah, it's 130. The volume in here is going to be 130. Once you pump, you don't pump the whole blood, you pump only 70. So right here it always stays like 60 more or less. So then that's why it's called isovolumetric relaxation. So let's keep going down, and we can see this with a little bit more detail. It here says the rising pressure in the ventricles. We already talked about it. The aorta and the pulmonary valves, obviously if the pressure is higher. So I hope that you guys are clear with that. Obviously, well, in here says valvular insufficiency disorders. Obviously, if there's going to be problems with the valves, then the valves will not close or will not open the way they are supposed to be, and that's going to cause a lot of problems. Heart sounds. Heart sounds are the sounds that are produced by the valves. When the atrioventricular valves close, that is the first sound, the first heart sound. And when the when the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve close, that is the second heart sound. Sometimes people can have third heart sounds, but that's not something that is normal. So it's normal, but not in everybody. So let's go back to the figure up here so you guys can see it. So the first thing that is going to happen is the blood goes from the atrium to the ventricle. These valves are going to close, this one and this one. They close. That's the first heart sound. Then the semilunar valve in the pulmonary and the semilunar valve in the aorta, they're going to close. That's the second heart sound. So those are the two sounds that you are supposed to know, and you can hear them with the stethoscope, and that obviously is going to be normal, and you should know that. You need to know that. So again, we have in here the cardiac cycle. We already talked about it. This is just a graph showing you the different type of pressures that you have in there. You don't need to know any of this for my class. This is just a graph showing you what happens in your heart at the same time. So it's looking not only at how the blood flows in your heart, also how the heart contracts, and how you see that in the electrocardiogram. So that's just a nice graph, but if you want, you can look at it. So if you have in here cardiac cycle, again, we said first is ventricular filling, right? Ventricular filling. So I told you it's more or less 130 milliliters of blood. That's the ventricular filling. Okay. Then the next step, as we said, is isovolumetric contraction, because even though the ventricle is contracting, the blood does not get pumped because the pressure in the ventricle is lower than the pressure in the semilunar valves and the pulmonary trunk, for example. Therefore, it will not be able to pump the blood until the pressure in the ventricle is higher than in the semilunar valve. And in that case, now you go to number 3, in which is going to be ventricular ejection. Okay, so ventricular ejection is the other one. And the last one, if we scroll down, right here. Oh, before we go to the next one, isovolumetric relaxation, as I said, we have 130 milliliters, right? That's the amount of blood that you have in the ventricle before it pumps it out. But the amount ejected, as you can see here, is only 70 milliliters. So basically, you are going to eject a little bit more than 50% of what the total amount of blood that you have in the ventricle. This amount that gets ejected is called the stroke volume. You should remember that. Okay, so then after that, obviously, we are going to have isovolumetric relaxation. Isovolumetric relaxation, in this case, the ventricle relaxes, right? Because first, as we said, is systole, right? Which is the ventricular ejection. This is systole. The heart contracts, so it produces ventricular ejection. I should say the ventricle contracts, it produces systole, and that's ventricular ejection. And after you have contraction, you have to have relaxation, which is going to be diastole. And that's obviously going to be called the isovolumetric relaxation. Isovolumetric relaxation is going to have a volume that is going to be 60 milliliters approximately, because we said that 70 milliliters is the amount that is going to be ejected, and that's what we're going to call stroke volume. So it's isovolumetric because it always remains 60 milliliters in your ventricles. Now, one thing that you need to understand is this is when your heart is working without much activity. Let's say when you're relaxing. So you're going to pump 70 milliliters and that's going to be your stroke volume. The reason why you don't pump everything, or one of the reasons why you don't pump anything, because if when you're relaxed, you pump 130 milliliters, what will happen when you are exercising? What else would you pump if everything is pumped when you are relaxed? So for that reason, obviously, you're going to inject 70 milliliters, right? But when you start exercising, then the amount of stroke volume may change and may go up to 80 or 90 milliliters or even 100 milliliters, because that's the amount of blood that you have to pump when you are doing physical activity. So that's basically the cardiac cycle. If we keep going down, then obviously here it's talking about the different sounds. As we said, S1, the first sound that we have in the heart, is when the atrioventricular valves close, and S2 is when the valves in the aorta and in the pulmonary trunk are going to close. So that's something that you need to know. Let's keep going down. Overview of volume changes. Okay, we said that when the heart already pumps, it's going to pump. The stroke volume is going to be 70 milliliters, so you have in there 60 milliliters left. Then the atrium is going to pump the blood, right, from the atrium to the ventricle, 30 milliliters. This just falls because of, for example, gravity. And then the atrium is going to produce systolic contraction. That's another 40. So this total is going to be 130. What's the stroke volume again? In the ventricular systole is 70 milliliters. And the end systolic volume again is going to be 60. And the cycle starts over again. So if you keep scrolling down, another thing that is very important that you need to understand is what it says in here. Equal output by the two ventricles is essential to homeostasis. You cannot pump more in the right ventricle, because then the blood will get accumulated in your lungs. And you cannot pump more in your left ventricle compared to your right ventricle, because then otherwise the blood is going to be accumulated in your body. So one concept that you need to understand is the amount of blood that you pump in your right ventricle is the same amount of blood that you pump in your left ventricle. So right ventricle and left ventricle are going to pump the same amount, because otherwise blood is going to accumulate either in your lungs or in your body. And obviously that's going to cause a problem. You may die from that. So if you keep scrolling down, well, in here it's just explaining what I was telling you. Right ventricle output is more than ventricle output. You start accumulating fluid in the lungs. And down here, obviously, probably we're going to have right here, the left ventricle output is higher than the right ventricle. Then the fluid accumulates in your body. Okay. So then if you keep scrolling down, let me see. That's obviously going to be called congestive heart failure, and that's about it. Nothing else for this.